The Trump administration has escalated its attacks on the International Criminal Court, imposing new sanctions on its president as well as a senior prosecutor. The measures bar them from entering the US and from carrying out transactions there in the US financial systems. Now, the ICC has criticised the decision, releasing a statement today saying these sanctions are a flagrant attack against the independence of an impartial judicial institution. When judicial actors are threatened for applying the law, it is the international legal order itself that is placed at risk. Trump administration's latest effort to undermine the ICC, the court's under intense pressure from the US government, primarily because of its investigation into the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over alleged war crimes in the Gaza Strip. One of the court members targeted in these latest sanctions was a lead prosecutor in the Netanyahu investigation. Well, the court says the United States has now sanctioned half of its judges and both deputy prosecutors. The US is also increasing the pressure on countries to withdraw from the court. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said the US wants to dismantle the ICC brick by brick. Here's how he described it last month.
Hey there, it's John, and today is a good one. The U.S. sanctioned ICC President Tomoko Akane and senior trial lawyer Abdul Lazier a full-blown financial assault on the court's top officials. The move has sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, yet most Americans are unaware their government just targeted the world's permanent war crimes tribunal. Now, let's be crystal clear about what these sanctions actually mean in practical terms, because this is where things get genuinely frightening. These two individuals are now completely frozen out of the American financial system. They cannot conduct any transactions with U.S. citizens. They cannot access any U.S.-linked financial institutions. Any assets they might have sitting in American jurisdictions can be seized immediately.
The International Criminal Court is an illegitimate international organization that, frankly, illegitimate. They've made themselves illegitimate because they claim that even if you're not a member of that court, they can come after you. These are the people that think they can go out and basically indict any world leader and haul them into The Hague.
Well, Alex Whiting is a professor of practice at Harvard Law School, where he specializes in international criminal law. He's also worked extensively as an international prosecutor. Welcome to the day. From the outside, this looks like the White House getting the court because it issued an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister for alleged war crimes. Is that too simplistic?
No, I think that is an important part of what's going on here. It's not the full picture. The United States began to impose sanctions on prosecutors and judges at the court as a result of the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant in Israel. So that certainly was an important motivator. I think a second thing that's happening here is this administration actually is concerned.
This is the exact same treatment the U.S. government reserves for sanctioned dictators, terrorist financiers, and international drug lords. Think about that for just one moment. The president of an international court is now being treated like a global criminal, not because she committed any crime, but because she's doing her job. The administration's stated justification for these sanctions is that these officials have been involved in efforts to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute individuals connected to governments that have not consented to the ICC's jurisdiction. In other words, the U.S. is saying, you're going after leaders from countries that never agreed to be under your authority, and we're going to use American financial power to make you pay for it. This is an extraordinary move by any measure. The United States is effectively saying that the International Criminal Court has overstepped its bounds.
That the court might in the future issue arrest warrants for Americans as a result of actions in, for example, the high seas or in Central and Latin America. The U.S. military is taking steps, for example, blowing up boats, suspected, alleged drug boats in the oceans that some have described as being crimes against humanity, and I think there is some concern on the part of this administration that the court might one day try to act against American officials.
See, what's interesting about that is, of course, that US hostility towards the ICC isn't new. Joe Biden described the court's arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu as outrageous. Is that just because, and of course, the US is not a signatory to the court. So does that antipathy stem from the role that America has played around the world for so many decades?
And the price for that overstep is going to be financial devastation for its leadership. Here's where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, and where most people completely miss the bigger picture. This fight between the US and the ICC didn't just appear out of thin air. It's tangled up with something that has been brewing for months now. The International Criminal Court has issued outstanding arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. These warrants are connected to allegations about how the war in Gaza has been conducted. Now, Netanyahu and Gallant are two of America's closest allies on the world stage. So when you look at this situation through the right lens,
well, I think the U.S. historically has had a very hot and cold or up and down relationship with the International Criminal Court. It's had moments of hostility, for example, in 2000, when the court first began operating in 2002. Again, at the beginning of the Trump administration, as you said, President Biden also condemned the court for the arrest warrants against Netanyahu. But at other times, the U.S. has been very supportive of the court, has even turned to the court to take actions in places like Sudan, 2005, in Libya in 2011, and Ukraine in 2022. And that was bipartisan. Both Democrats and Republicans in the United States supported the International Court conducting investigations. I do think that when the court acts or threatens to act against the United States or against close allies, then things are different. And the government, the administration, and this is true for Democrats and Republicans.
You start to see the real shape of this story. The Trump administration isn't just arguing about abstract jurisdictional questions. They're using American economic might to shield a key ally from international accountability. This is not a subtle distinction. It's the heart of the entire controversy. Critics around the world are saying exactly this, that the US is actively undermining international law to protect Israel. Meanwhile, the administration insists this is really about the ICC exceeding its proper authority by targeting countries that never signed up to be under the court's jurisdiction. Both sides have legitimate arguments, and honestly, you need to understand both perspectives.
Tend to push back against the court. And I will say that initially you might say in past administrations, the thinking was that the U.S. could take care of its own, war crimes allegations domestically, that there was no need for an international criminal court because the U.S. would conduct investigations of its own personnel for alleged crimes. I think it's different with this administration. I think this administration does not have any faith or belief in the rule of international law when it comes to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And I think that this administration is being protective of U.S. personnel and U.S. officials because of the very aggressive actions that it's taking around the world militarily.
Okay. Let's take a look at a couple of the allegations that the US has made against the court. We've recently seen the court's chief prosecutor dismissed over allegations of sexual misconduct. The White House claims the court is corrupt and fatally politicized. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Before you can even begin to form a reasonable opinion about what's happening here. Now, before we go any further, I need to clear something up because there's a lot of misinformation floating around online about this story. There is no arrest warrant for Donald Trump. There is no credible report anywhere suggesting that Trump personally faces any kind of arrest alert. That is simply not happening. What is real and honestly dramatic enough on its own, without any exaggeration, is that the Trump administration just went nuclear against the leadership of the world's war crimes court, specifically because of that court's actions against countries that don't accept its authority. The fact that the administration targeted the ICC president and a senior trial lawyer with financial sanctions that could effectively destroy their professional lives is already massive news. Let's take a moment to understand who these people actually are, because names and titles matter immensely in a story like this. Tomoko Akane isn't some junior staffer at the ICC. She's the president of the entire institution, the highest-ranking official there is. She's a career judge with decades of experience working in international law. This isn't someone who wandered into this position by accident or through political connections. She earned her place through years of dedication to the principles of international justice. And now, she's sitting on a U.S. sanctions list right alongside people the government usually reserves for genuinely dangerous actors. That's a striking detail worth sitting with for a second before we move on. Abdulaziz works as a senior trial lawyer at the court, which means he's directly involved in building and presenting actual cases in front of ICC judges. These are serious, established legal professionals, not political appointees, not activists pushing an agenda. They're the kind of people who spend their entire careers working inside international law. And now, both of them are facing financial consequences that could effectively end their ability to function in their roles. The sanctions don't just affect them personally either. They ripple outward into how banks, airlines, and other institutions around the world treat these individuals. A lot of financial institutions, even ones based entirely outside the United States, choose to avoid doing business with sanctioned individuals altogether, just to steer clear of any risk of violating U.S. regulations. The ICC itself came out swinging almost immediately after the sanctions were announced. They called this a flagrant attack on the court's independence. That strong language coming from an international judicial body is significant. They don't usually throw around words like flagrant attack casually. The court also warned that targeting judicial officials directly like this undermines the rule of law more broadly, not just in this one specific case, but as a dangerous precedent for how powerful countries might treat international courts going forward. And it's not just the ICC pushing back either. The Netherlands, which is where the court is actually headquartered, criticized the sanctions publicly too. A U.S. ally in Europe openly criticizing an action by the U.S. government is not a small thing. Diplomatically, the Netherlands specifically said that international courts need to be free to carry out their mandates without this kind of outside interference or pressure. That's basically a direct rebuke of what the Trump administration just did. Coming from a country that's usually a pretty reliable partner to the United States on the world stage. When you sanction the sitting president of a major international court, you're not just making one narrow legal argument. You're sending a signal to every other country and every other institution about how the U.S. is willing to use its financial power going forward. And that signal is landing very differently depending on where you're sitting, whether you're in Washington, Jerusalem, The Hague, or anywhere else in between. This is where the story opens up into something much bigger than just one round of sanctions against two people. It becomes a real question about whether Trump's broader foreign policy approach is starting to isolate the United States from its traditional allies and from the international institutions that have shaped global politics for decades. The kind of move we're watching here gets discussed in foreign ministries and embassies all over the world. It's the kind of decision that has lasting consequences, even if most people at home aren't paying attention to it yet. And make no mistake, people around the world are paying attention. They're watching to see whether the United States will push even harder, whether other countries will push back, and whether this becomes a defining moment in international law. Let's rewind and really understand what the International Criminal Court actually is, because there's a lot of confusion about this. Many people hear ICC and assume it's part of the United Nations or some other international body they've heard of before. It's not the same thing at all. The ICC is a separate, standalone court based in The Hague in the Netherlands. Its entire job is prosecuting the most serious crimes that the international community recognizes. War crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, that kind of thing. The court doesn't have its own army or police force. It relies on member countries to actually carry out arrests when the court issues a warrant. And this is a crucial detail. The United States has never fully joined the ICC as a member. So right away, you've got this weird tension baked into the whole relationship. An international court operating with real authority in a lot of the world, but without the backing or membership of the most powerful country on earth. The ICC generally only has authority over crimes committed on the territory of member countries, crimes committed by nationals of member countries, or cases specifically referred to it by the United Nations Security Council. The United States has never ratified full membership in the court, and neither has Israel for that matter. So when the ICC goes after officials from non-member countries, there's a genuine, long-standing legal debate about whether the court actually has the authority to do that in the first place. This isn't some brand new argument Trump's team just invented out of nowhere. Versions of this exact jurisdictional dispute have been playing out for years across multiple administrations, going back well before Trump ever got involved in it personally. This matters because it tells you that the administration's position here is consistent with a longer history of American skepticism about the ICC. Whether you agree with that skepticism or not, it's not something that just appeared overnight. It's been a feature of U.S. foreign policy for decades now. And it's worth stepping back and thinking about the history here because this isn't actually the first time the U.S. has clashed with the ICC over sanctions. Back during Trump's first term, his administration also imposed sanctions on ICC officials, including the court's chief prosecutor at the time, over the court's investigation into alleged war crimes by American forces in Afghanistan. Those earlier sanctions were eventually lifted under the following administration. So what we're watching right now isn't some brand new, unprecedented tactic appearing out of nowhere. It's actually a return to a strategy Trump's team has used before, just now aimed at a different set of officials over a different set of prosecutions. That history matters because it tells you this approach reflects a consistent, deliberate policy position rather than some one-off reaction to a single news cycle. Now let's talk about the reaction, because this move did not go over quietly at all. The International Criminal Court itself made a statement that was remarkably strong for an institution that typically operates through careful legal language. They called the sanctions a flagrant attack on the court's independence. When you hear language that strong from an international judicial body, you know something significant has happened. They're not just expressing disagreement. They're signaling that this is an existential threat to how they operate. The court also warned that targeting judicial officials directly like this undermines the rule of law more broadly, not just in this one specific case, but as a dangerous precedent for how powerful countries might treat international courts going forward. The Netherlands weighed in too. As the host country for the ICC, they have a particular interest in making sure the court can function properly. They criticized the sanctions publicly, insisting that international courts need the freedom to carry out their mandates without this kind of outside interference or pressure. Coming from a country that's usually a pretty reliable partner to the United States, that's a significant diplomatic development. It's not the kind of thing that happens casually. When an ally feels compelled to publicly criticize a U.S. action, it tells you that the action has crossed some line in their view. And these are exactly the kinds of diplomatic strains that can have lasting consequences. This is where the story opens up into something bigger than just one round of sanctions against two people. It becomes a real question about whether Trump's broader foreign policy approach is starting to isolate the United States from its traditional allies and from the international institutions that have shaped global politics for decades. When you sanction the sitting president of a major international court, you're not just making one narrow legal argument. You're sending a signal to every other country and every other institution about how the U.S. is willing to use its financial power going forward. And that signal is landing very differently depending on who you ask. Whether you're sitting in Washington, in Jerusalem, in The Hague, or anywhere else in between. It's the kind of move that gets discussed in foreign ministries and embassies all over the world, well beyond the handful of headlines it generates back here at home. The administration's argument is that the ICC has overstepped its authority entirely, going after leaders from countries that never consented to being under the court's jurisdiction in the first place, and that the court simply doesn't have the legal standing to do what it's trying to do here. Critics on the other side argue this is the U.S. actively undermining international accountability, specifically to shield an ally from consequences for alleged war crimes. Both of those arguments are actually out there in the real debate, happening right now. You should know both sides exist before you pick a lane on this one, because this is not a simple story with obvious good guys and bad guys. It's a messy, complicated legal and political battle that touches on fundamental questions about how international justice should work in a world of sovereign states. Let's think through the practical possibilities of where this could go, because sanctions like these usually aren't a one-time event that just fades away quietly on their own. The ICC could respond in a few different ways going forward. It could continue issuing strong public statements, keeping pressure on through diplomatic channels and international forums. Member countries sympathetic to the court, and there are dozens of them around the world, could push back through their own diplomatic relationships with Washington. There's also a real possibility this ends up affecting broader U.S. relationships with European allies specifically, given that so many ICC member states are concentrated in Europe, and given that the Netherlands has already stepped forward publicly to criticize the move. On the other side, the Trump administration could double down further, potentially expanding sanctions to additional ICC officials if the court continues pursuing cases the administration considers illegitimate. That's exactly the pattern we saw play out during Trump's first term too, when similar sanctions eventually escalated before getting reversed under the next administration. Whether that same cycle repeats itself this time around remains an open question, one that's going to depend heavily on how loudly allies push back, how the ICC itself chooses to respond, and honestly, how much domestic political attention this story actually gets here at home in the coming weeks. The ICC isn't going to just quietly back down after calling this a flagrant attack on its independence. That kind of language usually signals more pushback is coming, not less. And with Netanyahu and Gallant's warrants still sitting there active and unresolved, this entire standoff between Washington and The Hague is nowhere close to finished. The practical, day-to-day consequences of these sanctions deserve their own mention, separate from the bigger political questions. Once somebody gets added to a U.S. sanctions list like this, it doesn't just affect them personally. It ripples outward into how banks, airlines, and other institutions around the world treat that person too. A lot of financial institutions, even ones based entirely outside the United States, choose to avoid doing business with sanctioned individuals altogether, just to steer clear of any risk of running afoul of U.S. regulations themselves. That means Tomoko Akane and Abdul Asir could realistically face real difficulty with things most of us take for granted. Opening a bank account somewhere, booking certain flights, or handling basic financial transactions tied to their work at the court. So even though this is framed as a diplomatic dispute, the actual impact lands on two real people trying to do their jobs at an international institution. It's worth emphasizing this point because it's easy to get lost in the abstract legal and political arguments and forget that there are human beings on the receiving end of these sanctions. People who have dedicated their careers to the ideals of international justice are now being treated like criminals by the world's most powerful nation. Let's be clear about what this story actually is, because that clarity matters more than ever with how fast misinformation spreads online these days. This is not some story about Trump personally facing arrest. There's no credible report anywhere supporting that particular claim, so don't let anybody online convince you otherwise. What this actually is Trump's administration taking direct, concrete financial action against the leadership of the world's permanent war crimes court, tied closely to that court's ongoing prosecution efforts against countries and leaders it considers outside its jurisdiction, including close U.S. allies facing active warrants right now. That's the real story. And honestly, it's dramatic enough entirely on its own without anybody needing to exaggerate a single piece of it. Now let's talk about why any of this actually matters beyond just being one isolated headline for a single day. There are real immediate practical stakes here on the international side. Sanctions against sitting officials at a major court can make basic things genuinely harder. Cross-border travel for those individuals, ordinary banking, the day-to-day operational work of running an international judicial body. This isn't just symbolic posturing. It has real-world consequences for how the court actually functions going forward. Second, there are domestic political stakes tangled up in this too. Trump is demonstrating right here, in a very concrete and public way, a real willingness to use American financial power directly against an international institution, specifically one that could threaten allied leaders with prosecution. That's a meaningful signal about how this administration plans to use economic tools as a form of foreign policy leverage going forward. Not just against adversaries either, but potentially against any institutions seen as threatening to allies Trump wants to protect. This connects to a broader pattern worth noticing across Trump's approach to foreign policy. Generally, sanctions have become one of the most frequently used tools in this administration's toolkit, applied not just to hostile governments and individuals, but increasingly to institutions themselves, including international bodies that the U.S. has complicated, sometimes tense relationships with. That represents a real shift in how sanctions traditionally get used, moving away from purely punishing bad actors toward using financial pressure as leverage in broader jurisdictional and political disputes. Whether you see that as smart, aggressive strategy or as an overreach of American financial power probably depends a lot on where you already stand politically. But either way, it's a pattern worth watching closely as this administration continues. Third, it matters because of what it says about America's relationship with international institutions more broadly, going beyond just this one specific court and this one specific dispute. When a close ally like the Netherlands feels compelled to publicly criticize a move like this, that tells you something real about how U.S. foreign policy decisions are landing overseas among the countries the U.S. usually counts on for support. It raises a genuine question worth sitting with. Is the U.S. strengthening its alliances right now through moves like this, or is it slowly straining them instead? There's a fourth angle worth mentioning too, and it's one that doesn't get talked about enough in coverage of stories like this. Every time the U.S. uses sanctions as a tool against an institution, rather than against an individual bad actor or a hostile government, it sets a kind of precedent that other powerful countries can point to later. If the United States can sanction the leadership of an international court over a jurisdictional dispute, that opens a door, at least rhetorically, for other major powers to justify similar moves against institutions they disagree with too. Russia, China, and other governments that already have their own complicated, often hostile relationships with international courts and human rights bodies could potentially point back to this exact move as justification for their own actions down the road. That's not a certainty by any means, but it's the kind of ripple effect worth keeping in mind whenever a powerful country takes a step like this one. Because the precedents we set today shape the world we live in tomorrow. And the signal the United States is sending right now is that international institutions are not off limits. If they pursue cases against allies, they can face consequences. That message resonates far beyond The Hague. It reaches every international institution that operates without the full backing of the United States. And it reaches every country that looks to America for leadership on international law and human rights. Let's also take a second to explain who Netanyahu and Gallant actually are. For anybody who hasn't been following that specific story closely, Benjamin Netanyahu is the sitting prime minister of Israel, one of the most prominent and longest-serving leaders in that country's history. He's been a central figure in Israeli politics for decades, and his relationship with Trump has been extremely close. Yoav Gallant served as Israel's defense minister during a significant stretch of the Gaza war, before eventually leaving that role. The ICC issued arrest warrants for both of them tied to allegations connected to how the war in Gaza was conducted. Allegations both men and the Israeli government have firmly denied. Those warrants technically mean that if either man travels to a country that recognizes ICC authority, that country would theoretically be obligated to arrest them and hand them over to the court. In practice, that hasn't happened, largely because a lot of countries, including the United States, don't recognize the court's jurisdiction over Israeli officials in the first place. But the warrants themselves are still sitting there, active, unresolved, hanging over both men's international travel and diplomatic standing. This is the context that makes the U.S. sanctions so significant. The ICC is pursuing cases against key U.S. allies, and the Trump administration is using every tool at its disposal to push back against those efforts. Where does this go from here? Let's think through the practical possibilities, because sanctions like these usually aren't a one-time event that just fades away quietly on their own. The ICC could respond in a few different ways going forward. It could continue issuing strong public statements, keeping pressure on through diplomatic channels and international forums. Member countries sympathetic to the court, and there are dozens of them around the world, could push back through their own diplomatic relationships with Washington, potentially raising the issue at the United Nations or through other multilateral bodies. There's also a real possibility this ends up affecting broader U.S. relationships with European allies specifically, given that so many ICC member states are concentrated in Europe, and given that the Netherlands has already stepped forward publicly to criticize the move. On the other side, the Trump administration could double down further, potentially expanding sanctions to additional ICC officials if the court continues pursuing cases the administration considers illegitimate. That's exactly the pattern we saw play out during Trump's first term too, when similar sanctions eventually escalated before getting reversed under the next administration. Whether that same cycle repeats itself this time around remains an open question, one that's going to depend heavily on how loudly allies push back, how the ICC itself chooses to respond, and honestly, how much domestic political attention this story actually gets here at home in the coming weeks. The ICC isn't going to just quietly back down after calling this a flagrant attack on its independence. That kind of language usually signals more pushback is coming, not less. And with Netanyahu and Gallant's warrants still sitting there active and unresolved, this entire standoff between Washington and The Hague is nowhere close to finished. The sanctions against Tomoko Akane and Abdulaziz are just the opening move in what could become a prolonged diplomatic battle. The international community is watching closely. Allies are choosing sides. And the fundamental question at the heart of this dispute, whether an international court can hold leaders accountable when powerful countries refuse to accept its authority, is not going to be answered anytime soon. The sanctions on ICC leadership will have real consequences for the court's operations and ripple through diplomatic circles for months. Whether supported or opposed, this is a pivotal moment in international law. The U.S. has drawn a line, and the world is deciding how to respond. The next chapter could come at any moment.